All right, everyone. Today is the final topic of our AP World Curriculum. It's been a long time coming, but this is 9.8 Institutions Developing in a Globalized World. So, your essential question is to identify and explain how international organizations help maintain peace and promote international cooperation today. So, our language of the curriculum, our historical developments, new international organizations, including the United Nations, formed with the stated goal of maintaining world peace and facilitating international cooperation. So, let's start with the UN, which is a good place to start. The United Nations, which was established immediately following World War II, it did so replacing the League of Nations, which the League of Nations failed for a lot of reasons. One of it was just never got full participation by the world superpowers, especially the United States. And so the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, and so therefore it didn't seem like something that was worth keeping around. So a new organization, an international organization known as the United Nations, would be formed, and it's different because it could solve disputes between countries to avoid that global conflict through diplomacy and other means. But all major powers also joined, include the United States at this time. So the UN is made up of different assemblies, and the major assembly, the first assembly, is the General Assembly, which is the one that makes up the entire body of the United Nations. All members and countries that are members of the United Nations have representation in this body, and each country gets one vote. And so even a country like the United States, which is much more powerful than a country like Montenegro, they still have equal representation in the General Assembly. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily equals within the United Nations itself. But any resolution that must be voted on by the General Assembly, the United Nations is going to have to pass it through 2/3 majority of the member votes. The next part of it is known as the Security Council. This is probably the most important, and the big difference between the League of Nations and the United Nations is the Security Council advises and authorizes on use of military force with anything that could be possibly used for it, whether sending in peacekeepers or authorizing to use military force against a country that steps outside the UN principles. For example, the United Nations authorized the military for use against Iraq after it invaded Kuwait in 1990, which led to a coalition of military led by the United States, the UK, Saudi Arabia, and others that are going to remove the Iraqi forces out of Kosovo. The Korean War was authorized by the United Nations and the Security Council as well. But the Security Council itself has 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, China, the British, and the French, or UK and France. And they are the 5 permanent members, and each one of them has veto power. They can veto a resolution. So if they all don't agree, then the veto power will be used. But then it also rotates 10 other countries in and out. They serve terms where they, are represented in the Security Council, and every 5 years, or I don't remember what the term is, but they rotate them out every once in a while. But you also have the Secretariat, which is basically the administrative body. It's headed by the General Secretary, who oversees the administration of the United Nations in general. So the Secretary General is voted by the UN, but all members of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must approve of the General Secretary, whoever that gets chosen. Then you also have the International Court of Justice, something I've mentioned briefly in previous lectures, which settle disputes between countries, but they also try people for human crimes, or crimes against humanity is a better way of putting it. The Economic and Social Council, which directs the economic and humanitarian aid, helping refugees, and also directing money towards developing countries to help with humanitarian crises that they might happen, or development of their of infrastructure, whatever it might be. And then the Trustee Council, which really has been not really active since 1994, but it helps kind of land become self-governing and independent. For example, it's them who helped establish the state of Israel after World War II, I think in 1947. And took the mandate of Palestine that the British had under control and gave it to Jewish refugees and Zionists that had already been in Israel to create their own state for the Jewish people, which was what Israel was created for. But that, of course, affected the people who also live in there, Palestinians, which is a conflict that has been going on for years. And it's too complex to really talk about in this class, but it's certainly something that does come up in our global history. Kind of the number one priority of the United Nations to ensure world peace. And so they have different ways of going about peacekeeping missions. They can send special envoys to help solve issues between nations or within nations to try to prevent a local conflict from becoming something of a global conflict. And if you go back to World War I, remember that the assassination of one man ended up sparking a global World War in World War I. And so, there are steps that are taken to prevent regional and local conflicts from becoming worldwide conflicts. They've also sent in peacekeeping forces that are made up of multiple countries that will send soldiers in to help kind of police, a conflict area or area where there is heavy conflict. So there are trouble spots that have been sent in for all over. Some examples: the conflict between Israel and Palestine, ethnic conflict that exists in Congo, political unrest in Lebanon, Somalia, where the government basically dissolved overnight and led it into chaos between different warlords trying to gain control over the country. Rwanda, where we talked about the ethnic violence that happened between the Tutsis and the Hutu. And of course, the Balkans and the Yugoslav war, which, hopefully you talked about that in AP Hug. But the Yugoslavia was once one united country that had 6 different provinces. And, once the Cold War had ended, some of these provinces that were diverted because of ethnic identities, they started to break away, which led to wars. And so, the peacekeepers have been sent in multiple times to keep the conflicts from getting too bloody. And then, of course, things like ethnic cleansing occurred in those Yugoslav wars. So there are other missions of the United Nations. They can protect refugees. They help with refugees. So the UNHCR, which is the main body of the UN that helps with refugees to get them housing, food, water, basic necessities, and find placement for them on temporary and sometimes permanent thing. Combat famine around the world, education, science, and culture. They have UNICEF, which protects like World Heritage's sites and such. So things like the Acropolis and the Great Mosque of Janneh, which we talked about way at the beginning of the year. Those are all UNICEF protected, sites to make sure they preserve culture for generations and generations. They also have human rights watches, determining whether ethnic cleansing or genocide is occurring, and whether or not the UN has to get more involved in it by sending in peacekeepers. So they do that. And then, of course, they also voted in 2017 on a new series of developmental goals known as the Sustainable Development Goals, which they hope to achieve by 2030, of which you can see here on this graphic is what they're and there's definitely more to it and policy wise than just kind of simply saying reduce inequalities. There's more specifics to it, but these are the areas of the 17 goals that they're trying to achieve by 2030. Other international organizations that are worth noting is the World Bank, which I talked briefly in the reactions to globalization, the anti-globalist movement. A lot of them are anti-World Bank and anti-IMF, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But the whole World Bank was established in 1944. And it was to give loans out for infrastructure projects, building of dams and roads and things like that to help with development for some of these poorer countries. They would also later give money to support in helping protect local environments as well as protecting cultures. But there have been criticisms of this in the past, some of which I talked about in the previous. But some of them will say that the money that they've given to projects like damming up is called as environmental degradation that is unreversible or irreversible as a result. Excuse me. And then profits made from the projects would go overseas rather than to local communities. So the wealthier countries are getting wealthier because they're the big, financiers of the World Bank itself. They also, the International Monetary Fund, which was created in 1945, was to help promote stability for countries' currency rates, so that they don't deal with things like inflation or hyperinflation or deflation, whatever it might be. And so it would give short-term loans and economic advice to help these developing countries get that on track financially. But the criticisms of that was that it was too heavily influenced by wealthier nations, which then they would use the IMF to help benefit themselves more than these in local countries. And they didn't. Another criticism, they didn't do enough to take into account the individual needs of these countries rather than just kind of what the needs were of the general world itself. And the last thing that you're talking about international organizations, you can't not mention NGOs or non-governmental organizations. They are not, they're independent and typically privately ran organizations that are geared towards a number of things that deal with international peace and environmental protection and a whole bunch of other things. So there's thousands and thousands of them. And if you have the PowerPoint up, you can click on this website and it'll give you a list of hundreds of thousands of different NGOs that exist in the world today. So things like trying to, get clean water to peoples in developing countries, protecting endangered species. There's a lot of them. There's one of the big ones is the International Peace Bureau, which was established in 1891, which of course is an NGO that works towards world peace. And so, some of the things they've done, they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1910. In 1980, a lot of their focus has been trying to disarm, towards nuclear disarmament of countries that have nuclear weapons. So, these are just some examples of the different NGOs, but there's lots and lots of them out there. But just know what an NGO is and how they function in relation to, they're kind of the go-between between local issues and governments, or grassroots movements and governments, and so they kind of go between the two to try to find ways to better help these local issues as they exist around the world. And that's it. And that's the last essential question. And this is Mr. Henry signing off.